You don't belong here. The words hit Jasmine Smith like a slap in the face, but she didn't flinch. She stood tall in the middle of the courtroom, her hands clenched by her sides, ready to face the judge who had already written her off. The room, filled with powerful figures in expensive suits, fell into a tense silence as they waited for her to speak. Jasmine, a woman who had worked tirelessly to make a living for herself and her son, had never imagined she would find herself in this position, but here she was, about to face the same kind of discrimination she had dealt with her whole life. As the judge, a man with graying hair and a cold gaze, looked down at her from his elevated seat, she knew exactly what he was thinking. He saw her as just another poor, black woman with nothing of value to contribute. "Ms. Smith," he sneered, his voice dripping with disdain, "perhaps you should just sit down. This case is for those who understand the law." His words were sharp, cutting through the air, but Jasmine didn't take her eyes off him. The courtroom murmured, some agreeing with the judge, others shifting uncomfortably. But Jasmine remained unshaken. She wasn't going to back down. Not today. Not when the truth was on her side. As she stepped up to the witness stand, the judge's expression twisted into something between amusement and irritation. He obviously believed she didn't have what it took to be there, that someone like her, someone who had been dismissed and belittled all her life, couldn't possibly have anything of value to say. But Jasmine had a different plan. She had spent the last few weeks gathering evidence, digging into the case and uncovering truths that would turn this courtroom upside down. She had been quiet, observing, biding her time. But now, it was her turn to speak. The judge watched her, his gaze skeptical. "You may proceed, Ms. Smith," he said with a dismissive wave of his hand, clearly not expecting anything of importance. But Jasmine's voice cut through the silence like a razor. "Your Honor," she began, her words steady and confident, "there's something you need to know about this case. Something you overlooked. Something that will change everything." The judge's eyes narrowed. He had heard many claims, many people trying to undermine the case he had already decided. But this was different. There was something in Jasmine's tone, something he hadn't expected. She wasn't just some poor woman trying to make her mark, she was a force to be reckoned with. As she presented her evidence, the room grew tense. Each piece of information she shared sent a shockwave through the courtroom. The judge, who had been so sure of his position, could feel the ground shifting beneath him. His hands trembled slightly as he flipped through the papers she handed him, realizing that what she was saying was true. This wasn't just a case of a misunderstanding. It was far more than that. It was a case of corruption, of deceit. And it was happening right under his nose. The room was now fully silent, and all eyes were on the judge. Jasmine's quiet strength had cracked the facade of his arrogance. He froze. His mind raced, trying to comprehend the enormity of what she had just revealed. The truth had been right in front of him all along, but he had been too blind to see it. The judge looked up at Jasmine, his face pale, the weight of his mistake sinking in. He had underestimated her, belittled her, and now, he had to face the consequences of his actions. As the realization dawned on him, Jasmine stood there, unshaken. She had done what no one thought she could do. She had proven them all wrong. "I've spent my entire life being told I wasn't good enough," Jasmine thought to herself, standing firm in front of the judge. The courtroom was dead silent, the tension palpable. She had just laid out the evidence that would change everything, and now all eyes were on Judge Ford. He sat there, still frozen, his fingers gripping the papers she had handed him, as though trying to make sense of the impossible truth. Jasmine could see the shift in his expression, the arrogance, the superiority he had worn like a badge of honor, was now replaced with disbelief. The weight of his own mistakes was starting to sink in, and it was evident that he had underestimated her. For a moment, the room felt like it had frozen in time. Judge Ford's face had gone pale, his lips pressed tightly together, as if he were struggling to find the words to respond. Jasmine didn't give him the chance. She stood there, unwavering, her gaze locked onto his. She knew what this meant. She had taken back control, not with violence or anger, but with the quiet strength that had carried her through her toughest days. "You thought I didn't belong here," she said, her voice cutting through the silence. "You thought I was just some maid, some invisible person who wouldn't be able to stand up to you. But I'm more than that. I'm not just here to clean your floors or take your insults. I'm here because I have the truth, and the truth always finds its way to the surface, no matter how hard you try to bury it." Judge Ford's eyes flickered for a brief second, as though he were finally beginning to see her for who she really was. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his previous confidence slowly slipping away. The people in the room who had once dismissed Jasmine were now watching her, the room filled with a sense of awe and respect. "This case," Jasmine continued, "is not just about the law. It's about justice. And for far too long, the powerful have silenced the voices of people like me. But not today." The judge slowly placed the papers down on the table, his hands shaking ever so slightly. The gravity of the situation was becoming clear. Jasmine had done something that no one had expected, she had turned the tables. She wasn't the helpless woman that everyone assumed she was. No, she was the one in control now. As the judge slowly rose to his feet, the room held its breath. Was he going to admit his mistake? Was he going to finally acknowledge the injustice he had allowed to unfold under his watch? He cleared his throat, his voice now softer, but still carrying an edge of authority. "Ms. Smith," he said, his tone no longer mocking or dismissive, I didn't realize the extent of what you were bringing to light. I've made an error." The words were barely above a whisper, but they hit Jasmine like a thunderclap. For a moment, she felt as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet. This was it. The moment she had waited for. Judge Ford had admitted his mistake. And in doing so, he had given her the power she had fought so hard to reclaim. Jasmine's eyes didn't leave his. She didn't need to say anything. The truth was in the room, loud and clear. The judge had been humbled, and justice would be served. The battle was over. And Jasmine had won. "I was wrong," Judge Ford finally admitted, his voice trembling ever so slightly as he glanced over at Jasmine. He stood tall, but there was an unmistakable humility in his posture now. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next move, but Jasmine didn't flinch. She wasn't here for apologies. She was here for justice. Jasmine had never imagined that this moment would come, that the very man who had dismissed her, belittled her, would now stand before her, his power deflated. She had exposed him, not with anger, not with aggression, but with the truth that could no longer be ignored. The tension in the room was thick. The silence spoke louder than any words could. Judge Ford cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses, a sign that he was trying to regain some sense of control. But it was clear, the power had shifted. Jasmine could feel it in her bones. She wasn't just some invisible woman anymore. She was standing in front of a man who had learned what it truly meant to be humbled. "I need to address this situation properly," he continued, still speaking softer than before. "There will be an official investigation into the matter. And I want to make sure this case is handled with the integrity it deserves." Jasmine nodded, her expression calm but resolute. This was it. She had done what many thought was impossible. She had fought back against the very system that had tried to break her down. The truth was no longer just something she carried with her, it was now the foundation of the entire case. It wasn't just about her anymore, it was about everyone who had been dismissed or forgotten. She had opened the door for real change. "Thank you, Your Honor," Jasmine said, her voice steady and firm. "But this isn't just about me. This is about everyone who has been silenced, pushed aside because of who they are, because of where they come from. This is about making sure that no one else has to endure what I did." The judge nodded, a heavy weight settling on his shoulders. The other members of the court were beginning to stir, their gazes shifting between Jasmine and Judge Ford. No one had expected this outcome, not in a million years. Jasmine had turned the tables in the most unexpected way, and she had done it with grace and integrity. The judge turned to the rest of the court. "We will reconvene tomorrow," he said, his voice now filled with a sense of authority that had been absent before. "I will make sure the necessary actions are taken. The truth will be heard." Jasmine didn't need to say anything more. She had done her part. The rest would unfold as it should. As she walked out of the courtroom, her head held high, a sense of quiet triumph washed over her. She had fought for what was right, and she had won. It wasn't just the case she had won, it was her dignity, her self-respect, and the respect of everyone who had ever been made to feel small. The world might not have seen her for who she truly was before, but now, it would. And that was enough. The following morning, the courthouse was buzzing with activity, but Jasmine stood quietly at the back of the room, watching the proceedings unfold. She had expected to feel a sense of relief after the events of yesterday, but instead, she felt a calm resolve. The truth was now out there, and she had done what she needed to do. She wasn't here for applause or recognition. She was here because she had a responsibility to ensure that the justice system was held accountable. As the doors opened and Judge Ford entered the courtroom, there was an air of uncertainty that hadn't been present before. The usual confidence he had carried with him into every case was gone, replaced by a seriousness that made the entire room fall silent. The judge walked to his bench, and for the first time, his gaze met Jasmine's directly. For a moment, neither spoke. The weight of everything that had transpired hung in the air between them. It was as if they were both fully aware of the irreversible shift that had occurred. The judge cleared his throat, his voice steady, though still carrying a trace of humility. "Ladies and gentlemen, today we move forward with the case, but not as we originally planned. After reviewing the evidence and considering the events of yesterday, I am compelled to address the failures that have led us here." His words were met with silence, but Jasmine knew this wasn't just about the case. It was about the system, about the way people like her had been treated for far too long. And now, that system was being forced to reckon with its own mistakes. As the trial continued, Jasmine listened intently to the proceedings. It was clear that the tide had turned. The evidence she had presented, the truth she had uncovered, was now the focal point. There was no more room for denial. Every witness, every statement, every piece of information pointed back to the same undeniable fact: corruption had been allowed to thrive, and it had been hidden in plain sight. Judge Ford called for a brief recess, and Jasmine stepped outside for a moment to collect her thoughts. The courthouse steps felt colder than usual, but she didn't mind. She had come this far, and nothing was going to stop her now. As she stood there, taking a deep breath, she felt a tap on her shoulder. Turning around, she saw a familiar face. It was one of the attorneys from the case. He was a man she had never expected to speak to, but there was a genuine respect in his eyes now. "I just wanted to say thank you," he said, his voice low. "I never thought someone like you could bring down a case this big. You've done more than just expose the truth. You've shown us what real courage looks like." Jasmine nodded, grateful for the words, but she didn't need the recognition. She had done this for herself, for the people who had never had their voices heard. "It's not over yet," she replied quietly, turning back toward the courthouse doors. "But it's a step in the right direction." The trial continued into the afternoon, and when it was finally over, Jasmine felt the weight of the moment. The judge had ruled in favor of the plaintiffs, acknowledging the extent of the corruption and ordering a full investigation into the matters that had been exposed. Jasmine didn't need to hear the applause. She didn't need to hear the murmurs of approval. What mattered was that the system had been held accountable, that the truth had been revealed, and that justice had been served. As she walked out of the courthouse, she knew her fight wasn't over. There was still much to be done, but for the first time in a long time, she felt hopeful. The world might have overlooked her before, but now, it was paying attention. The next few weeks were a blur for Jasmine. The headlines had exploded with the details of the case: the judge's role in the scandal, and the unprecedented actions that had led to a reversal of fortune. People she had never met were congratulating her, recognizing her bravery. The weight of everything she had done began to settle into her bones, but Jasmine was determined not to let it consume her. She had accomplished what she set out to do, but she knew that one victory didn't change everything. The world wasn't going to magically become a place of equality just because one judge had been held accountable. She still had work to do. One afternoon, as she walked through the city, her phone buzzed. It was a message from her lawyer, a brief note telling her to meet him at his office. The tone was urgent, but not alarming. Jasmine had learned to read between the lines, to know when something was coming that required her immediate attention. When she arrived at his office, he was sitting behind his desk, papers spread out in front of him. He motioned for her to sit. "Jasmine," he began, his voice serious, "you've made a real impact, but there's more at play here than we initially realized. The investigation into Judge Ford's actions has opened a much bigger door. We're talking about corruption at levels we couldn't have imagined. Your case, what you uncovered, is just the beginning." Jasmine's heart skipped a beat. She had never expected this. She had known that the case was important, but now it seemed much larger than she had anticipated. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice steady but filled with curiosity. Her lawyer leaned forward, his expression grave. "The investigation is widening. The judge's connections run deep. And there are people in very high places who are nervous right now. This could go all the way to the top." Jasmine felt a surge of determination. She had started this fight because of what had happened to her, but now it seemed that she was on the brink of uncovering something far more significant. Something that could shake the foundations of the very system she had spent her life navigating. "So, what happens next?" she asked, her eyes narrowing as she absorbed the gravity of the situation. "We keep pushing," her lawyer replied. "We make sure the truth keeps coming out. But we need to be careful. There are people who don't want this to go public, and they will do everything in their power to stop it." Jasmine took a deep breath, her mind racing. She had faced challenges before, but this felt different. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about making sure the system was held accountable, about making sure that what happened to her didn't happen to anyone else. She stood up, her resolve stronger than ever. "I'm in," she said, her voice unwavering. "Let's make sure the truth comes out, no matter what it takes." Over the following weeks, Jasmine worked closely with her lawyer and a team of investigators. They dug deeper into the web of corruption that had been uncovered, following every lead, every piece of evidence that had been overlooked for years. Jasmine knew that this would not be easy. There were powerful forces working against them, people who had spent their lives manipulating the system to their advantage. But she was no longer afraid. She had already faced the most intimidating challenge of her life, and she had come out victorious. Now, she was ready for whatever came next. As the investigation gained momentum, Jasmine began to see how far-reaching the corruption truly was. There were politicians involved, corporate leaders, and powerful individuals who thought they were untouchable. But Jasmine had proved that even the most untouchable people could be held accountable. As the case expanded, Jasmine became more than just a witness. She became a symbol of courage, of standing up for what was right, even when the odds were against you. The world may have overlooked her before, but now they were paying attention. And Jasmine was determined to make sure that the system, the people in power, and the world knew that she would never back down. The fight had only just begun. As the investigation grew, Jasmine found herself at the center of something much bigger than she had ever imagined. The pieces were starting to fall into place, one by one, as the truth about the corruption and manipulation that had been taking place for years began to unfold. She had started this journey seeking justice for herself, but now, she was fighting for something much greater, a system that had failed countless others. Her team of investigators worked tirelessly, uncovering hidden deals, backroom agreements, and financial records that had been deliberately erased. Jasmine spent long hours poring over documents, her mind sharp and focused. Every time they uncovered a new piece of information, she felt the weight of the task ahead, but she was undeterred. She knew that this fight wasn't just for her, it was for every person who had ever been overlooked, mistreated, or silenced by the very system that was supposed to protect them. She had spent her life as a maid, invisible to those around her, but now, she was the one controlling the narrative. It wasn't easy. There were moments of doubt, times when she questioned if it was worth the risk. Powerful people with deep pockets were determined to stop the truth from coming to light, and they would stop at nothing to protect their interests. Jasmine knew that the deeper they dug, the more dangerous things would become. But she was ready. She had already faced the hardest battle of her life and come out victorious. There was nothing they could throw at her that would make her back down now. As the investigation reached its climax, Jasmine's role became even more crucial. She was called to testify again, this time in front of a wider audience, a public hearing that would expose the full extent of the corruption. The pressure was immense, but Jasmine remained calm. This wasn't about her, it wasn't about her past or her struggles. This was about justice. The day of the hearing arrived, and Jasmine walked into the room with a quiet confidence. She had learned to stand tall, to speak her truth without fear. As she took the stand once again, she saw the faces of those who had once doubted her, who had once thought she was nothing more than a maid. Now, they were listening. As she recounted the details of the case, explaining how she had pieced together the puzzle, she saw the shock in the eyes of those around her. The truth was undeniable. She had given them the evidence, and now it was up to them to act on it. The room was silent as the final pieces of the corruption were revealed. The people responsible for the exploitation and abuse of power were finally exposed, and Jasmine knew that her work had made a difference. As the hearing came to a close, Jasmine stepped down from the stand, her heart pounding in her chest. She wasn't sure what would come next, but she knew that she had done everything she could. She had fought for justice, and she had won. The fight wasn't over, but this was a victory she could hold on to. She had stood up to a system that tried to crush her, and in the end, the truth had prevailed. Jasmine left the courthouse that day with a sense of quiet triumph. She had made an impact, and nothing would ever be the same again. Months passed, and the reverberations of Jasmine's actions continued to echo through the city, through the very system she had fought against. The investigation into the corruption she had uncovered expanded further, and Jasmine found herself in the center of it all. Though the attention from the media had died down, the changes were beginning to take shape. She watched from the sidelines as new policies were implemented, the people responsible for the manipulation of the law were being held accountable, and a sense of reform started to sweep through the very institutions that had once seemed untouchable. The judge, the politicians, the corporate leaders, all of them were facing the consequences of their actions. It was a bittersweet victory. Jasmine had never asked for recognition. She hadn't done any of this for fame, for accolades, or for the approval of anyone who doubted her. But the changes were real. They were happening, and she knew that her role in making them happen was undeniable. She had done it. She had started the ripple that turned into a wave of justice. Yet, in the quiet moments, when the world wasn't watching, Jasmine felt the weight of everything she had been through. She had fought not only for herself but for everyone who had been silenced by the very system that was meant to protect them. And now, more than ever, she realized how far-reaching her journey had been. Her role in the case had never been about the accolades or the headlines. It had always been about creating a shift, about ensuring that people who had been treated like they didn't matter would finally be heard. It had been about showing the world that even the smallest, most overlooked voices could shake the foundations of power. Jasmine didn't want to be a symbol. She didn't want people to think of her as a hero. She wanted them to see the truth. And the truth was that justice had been delayed for too long, but it was never too late to make things right. She had proven that. The world had looked at her once and saw only a woman who served others, a woman who was invisible. Now, they saw her as something else, a force to be reckoned with. Jasmine smiled softly to herself, knowing that her work wasn't over, but the impact she had made was undeniable. As she stood at the edge of the city, looking out at the skyline, she felt a sense of peace wash over her. She had fought the good fight. The rest would follow. She had no idea what would come next, but she was ready for it. Whatever it was, she would face it head-on, just as she always had. As Jasmine sat in her small apartment, the city lights twinkling outside her window, she reflected on how far she had come. The world had changed around her, and she had played a pivotal role in that transformation. But deep down, she knew that true change wasn't just about exposing corruption, it was about the people who would benefit from it in the long run. It was about ensuring that those who had been pushed aside, those who had been silenced, would never have to feel that way again. Jasmine had become a symbol, not because she wanted to be, but because she had done what many thought was impossible. She had taken on a system that was designed to keep her in the shadows and turned it upside down. But even with all the attention, all the recognition, she never lost sight of why she had started. It had never been for glory. It had always been for justice. She thought back to the early days, when she first stepped into the courtroom, the doubts that had clouded her mind, and the fear of what might happen if she failed. But now, in the quiet of her home, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She had done it. She had made a difference. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from one of the journalists who had covered her story. "You've become the face of this movement. People are looking to you for guidance, for hope. How do you feel about it all?" Jasmine smiled softly, knowing that the journey had just begun. She wasn't done yet. There was still much to be done, still so much more to fight for. The world might have changed, but she wasn't ready to rest on her laurels. Her story, her fight, was only one part of a much larger narrative. She quickly typed her response, "It's not about me. It's about the people. We're all in this together. And we still have work to do." As she hit send, she looked out the window once more. The city was still bustling, still moving forward, just like she was. She had made a difference, but the world wasn't finished with her yet. There would always be new battles to fight, new challenges to face. But Jasmine was ready. She always had been. The morning light filtered softly through the blinds, casting long shadows across the small, quiet apartment. Jasmine sat by the window, the city bustling just beyond her view, but inside, everything felt still. Her breath was steady, slow, as though the weight of everything she had accomplished had finally settled into her bones. The noise of the world outside felt distant, muffled by the glass, as if she were watching it from another time, another place. She hadn't asked for this. She hadn't asked to become the face of a movement, to be the symbol of something much bigger than herself. Yet here she was, sitting in this moment of quiet reflection. She could still hear the echoes of the courtroom, the murmurs of the audience, the weight of the judge's final decision. But it was all fading now, replaced by the softness of her own thoughts. Her fingers rested lightly on the windowsill, feeling the coolness of the wood beneath them. The faint hum of the city below, the distant honking of horns, the soft shuffle of footsteps on pavement, seemed far away, as if the world itself had slowed down to match her own pace. There was no triumphant music, no fanfare. The moment didn't demand recognition, and Jasmine didn't seek it. The sunlight caught the edges of her hair, casting a soft halo around her face, but it was a quiet light, not the harsh glare of attention. She felt at peace, but it wasn't a peace of resolution. It was the peace that came from knowing the fight had been worthwhile, from knowing that what had been rightfully hers had been reclaimed, not in a moment of explosive victory, but in the steady rhythm of determination that had carried her to this point. Her gaze lingered on the city skyline, the buildings rising tall and indifferent to the small victories and losses of those who lived beneath them. The breeze from the open window brushed lightly against her skin, warm but with the edge of the coming summer heat. Everything felt muted, like the last note of a song fading into silence. There was no need for words now, no need for more to be said. Jasmine knew she had done what she set out to do. The world had seen her for who she truly was, not a maid, not a servant, but a person of dignity and strength. The truth had been heard. The silence in the room was not a void but a space where the echoes of what had been achieved could settle into place. Jasmine took one last breath, deep and steady, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she smiled. It was a small, quiet smile, a reflection of the quiet victory she had earned. And then, as the light continued to spill across the room, she stood, walked to the door, and stepped out into the world once more, no longer seeking permission to be seen, but simply existing, quietly, in the space she had earned.